New York City is filled with curiosities, but one of its more unique features is an abandoned, elevated railway that has been converted into a public park. That's right, the forgotten High Line is the living history of America's transportation past. And today we discover how this once critical mile-and-a-half-long elevated section of the New York Central Railroad's West Side Spur was abandoned, ultimately to become a park. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Our story starts during the Industrial Revolution, when New York State pioneered the railroad industry to expand its influence and accommodate the state's 19th century population boom. New York was always on the cutting edge of innovation. Although records for the first railroad telegraph were established in the United States on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1838, this form of rapid communication swiftly found itself inside New York proper. And this innovation significantly improved the efficiency and safety of railroad operations by enabling instant communication over long distances. This innovation also assisted in accommodating early, regularly scheduled service, specifically the New York and Harlem Railroad, one of the first in the entire country. Completed in 1856, the railroad revolutionized city transportation for the first time, making it possible to transport goods directly to the city on land, when previously the use of the Hudson River was required to transport goods into the city. Additionally, the new line gave easy access for passengers traveling to other cities, including Albany within New York State. But these early lines also facilitated interstate and even international travel to places like Massachusetts or as far away as Vermont, Canada. So with the convergence of the efficient long-distance transportation of the steam train and the instant messaging of the telegraph, New York's reach became vast, and the rail network within the city was changing as well, but not everyone was pleased. While New York was an innovator in the railroad industry, these innovations did not come without disasters. In fact, the trains in New York were notorious for causing injuries and even death. The street-level tracks were so deadly that New Yorkers nicknamed 10th Avenue as Death Avenue. At least 500 people were killed by New York City's street-level trains. And so the New York Central Railroad solution was to implement the so-called West Side Cowboys, early traffic guards on horseback who used red flags to warn citygoers of oncoming trains. The residents also found the smoke billowing out of the trains to be a major nuisance, and hence New York City banned steam trains in Manhattan on July the 26th, 1908. And as a side note, it was this ban in particular that led to the gradual transition to electric traction systems, such as electric trains and trolley cars, which were considered cleaner and safer alternatives for transportation within New York. Anyhow, by the 1920s, the public and political consensus knew it was time for greater reform. So the West Side Improvement Project was created in 1924. They planned to remove the dangerous railways from street level and replace them with the elevated highways that would become the High Line, or what you might now know as Highline Park. This project was also conservationist in nature, as removing these street-level tracks returned space to Riverside Park. And so it was. The West Side Improvement Project worked for over a decade, reforming New York City's road-level trains, with the last tracks being removed in 1941. The removal process worked in tandem with the construction of the High Line, and in 1934, the first track of the High Line was functional, designed with shipping goods in mind. In fact, the movement of product was so incorporated into the railway route that the tracks traveled directly through some buildings, facilitating deliveries for factories such as the National Biscuit Company. While this made easy access for factories, the design of these rail lines planned to travel over blocks rather than avenues. So to make room for the High Line, over 600 pre-existing buildings had to be demolished, leaving thousands of landlords and tenants out of luck. But it seemed that the trade-off was fair, as for the next 30 years, the High Line continued to be optimal for city transportation, with both passengers and goods utilizing the rails for travel. However, by the end of the 20th century, the Highline Railway fell out of favor with the public. You see, unlike its predecessor, the issues with the High Line were based on aesthetics and practicality. Instead of lethal dangers that the city once faced, the High Line trains were considered ugly, and as time went on, they were underused and undermaintained. In turn, the decaying and partially abandoned railway became an eyesore and contributed to a sense of neglect in the surrounding neighborhoods. It hindered economic development and deterred investment in the area. In other words, this ugly and unused rail line was bringing a part of Manhattan down. The High Line's outdated infrastructure and lack of maintenance presented a safety hazard as well, as portions of the structure falling apart posed risks to pedestrians and nearby buildings. This led to concerns about public safety and the potential for accidents. It's important to note here that as early as the 1960s, train transportation in general began to lose its popularity. You see, as automobiles became mainstream and accessible to the majority of the American public, the need for train travel, both for passengers and products, dwindled quickly. Trucks were much more optimal for transporting goods. Private automobiles traveled quickly and surpassed shared public transportation in popularity. And so it was. As utilization continued to decrease, parts of the railway were demolished, starting with the southernmost section. Then, by 1978, only 2 carloads of cargo traveled across the High Line each week. In 1980, the remaining rails were temporarily disconnected to accommodate separate construction. The rails were reconnected a year later, but were never really used. Aside from the final train, of course, which notably was a shipment of frozen turkeys. This would be the last time the High Line was ever used. Throughout the 1980s, activists fought against each other to both preserve and demolish the High Line. So in 1983, the West Side Rail Line Development Foundation was formed. Its founder, Peter Oblest, fought legal battles and offered to purchase the High Line to preserve it. Conrail, who owned the railway back then, accepted this offer as removing the rails would have cost them millions of dollars. But unfortunately for Mr. Oblest, this potential deal didn't really fly in court. Other proposals were made throughout the remainder of the decade, but ultimately, they fell through as well. Although no actions were taken, it became generally accepted that the railway would soon be totally demolished. At the turn of our century, in 1999, New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani designated an order to demolish the High Line, but it was countered by environmental enthusiasts who had noticed that wildlife was growing throughout the abandoned tracks, and hence they formed the Friends of the High Line in response. Joshua David and Robert Hammond founded the nonprofit organization to advocate for conserving space and maintaining available space for the growing public. The Friends grew and throughout the 2000s kept their focus on the Greenway. In 2003, the Friends started what they called an ideas competition to put their conservation efforts into the spotlight. This campaign was great PR for the High Line as public awareness grew in response to the creative drive. Rather than limiting submissions to practical architectural proposals, the Friends allowed creative but ultimately impractical suggestions as well, such as amusement park rides, which encouraged the public to become involved in the conservation movement. Following the ideas contest, the city government facilitated the creation of a public park by rezoning the High Line. Construction began in April of 2006, and the first part of the Highline Park opened to the public in 2009. Highline art was created that same year, tying the New York Park to New York's artistic community. Expansion continued throughout the early 2010s. Then, the most recent expansion to the park was in 2019, with the opening of the Spur, a space that protected and preserved the last remaining tracks of the Highline Railway. Located on 30th Street, the design was influenced by public opinion and described by the Highline management as, quote, to create moments of interactions both between people and with surroundings. The effect is potent as the area is surrounded by balconies and centered by Simone Lee's sculpture, Brick House, a 16-foot tribute to African American women. Some people believe that the High Line of today mirrors its original incarceration, but it now gives back to the local and modern priorities such as urban architecture and recreation. Accessible to the public, the park is co-managed by the city government's Department of Parks and Recreation and the Friends of the High Line. Now, hundreds of species of flora surround the greenway, creating a beautiful space for the community. Highline visitors can experience New York City's unique atmosphere from the amphitheater on 17th Street or the teak-seating steps on 23rd Street, where you can also learn something in the process as artists and educators host events at the Highline, making it a definitive setting for the culture of New York City. And if it's culture that you're after, visitors can also find varieties of cuisine at Chelsea Market on 15th Street before visiting the Garden with the famous Spur House rotating art exhibition. At 11th Avenue, a play area for children incorporates art into structure, including a musical chime bench that plays different notes when tapped. And it doesn't stop there. Music has often been incorporated into the art displayed at the Highline. For example, in 2010, Stephen Vitiello created a musical installation at High Point, incorporating bells heard throughout the city. As you might imagine, the park came to a close during the pandemic, but has since been reopened and with some new development. New York City Governor Cuomo shared plans to extend the park eastward to the new train hall and northward towards the Hudson River Park on January the 11th, 2021. At the time of the announcement, this plan had yet to be funded. Even so, construction on the eastward expansion began just over a year later. In the centuries since the railway's creation, New York City's High Line has become a cornerstone of American urban culture and a lovely example of historic preservation. Hit that subscribe button if you agree. Let me know what tale of urban decay you'd like to hear next in the comments section, and don't miss our controversial episode about New York's Cemetery Island by clicking right here. Until next time, this is Ryan Sokash, signing off.